Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 28, The Song of Roland. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, when Pippin died, he divided the enlarged Frankish kingdom between his two sons. In theory, the brothers would live in peace with each other, but it soon became clear that they were not capable of a harmonious relationship. Instead, each brother began making alliances with neighboring powers in preparation for a climatic showdown. Charles, the eldest son, made a marriage alliance with the Lombard king, while his younger brother Charlemagne tried to ally with the papacy. However, Charlemagne died suddenly, and Charles quickly gained control of his brother's lands. Meanwhile, Desiderius, king of the Lombards, had helped Pope Stephen deal with a violent tyrant who had attempted to control Rome. Naturally, Stephen was grateful, but he died and was succeeded by Hadrian, a more aggressive pope who asked for Frankish help to regain lands taken by the Lombards. Since he had already broken the marriage alliance with the Desiderius, Charles likely welcomed the excuse. Having fortified the main routes through the Alps, Desiderius was confident, so he rejected Charles's offer of a diplomatic solution. By the time that Charles learned that diplomacy had failed, it was summer. The Frankish army was divided in two. One army was led by Charles and the other by his uncle Bernard, an illegitimate son of Charles Martel. Pressed hard from two directions, the Lombard defenses broke and Desiderius fled to Pavia. Obviously, the Franks had not dragged siege equipment over the mountains, but they were able to surround the city in the fall of 773. Apparently, Desiderius had not expected that the Franks would be able to reach Pavia, so he had not prepared for a siege. Moreover, it is a good question how much support Desiderius could expect from the many Lombard dukes who viewed themselves as autonomous and grudgingly accepted Desiderius as king. There do not appear to have been any major attempts by other Lombard dukes to relieve the siege of Pavia. The siege dragged on for months, but Desiderius probably expected that the Franks would go home once winter started. Basically, that strategy had worked with Pippin, so he must have been stunned when the Frankish army stayed. But Desiderius somehow managed to hold out through the winter. A siege must be incredibly boring, so Charles decided to travel down to Rome for Easter. Naturally, he received an elaborate welcome ceremony from the Pope. After a bit of sightseeing, Charles returned to the siege. Desiderius proved to be stubborn, but he finally surrendered on June 5th. Honestly, the campaign was a remarkable achievement. Charles had to first convince his nobles to embark on a lengthy, dangerous journey, and then he had to arrange enough supplies to feed his army in a distant region. That was difficult, but not impossible. However, he managed to make his nobles agree to spend the winter away from their homes, which was extremely rare, and then ensure that they did not starve. The entire campaign, including the siege, lasted a year. To be fair, when Charles invaded Lombardy, many of his nobles had served with his father during Pippin's campaign, so they were familiar with the region. King Desiderius had another surprise when he finally surrendered, since instead of simply demanding tribute, Charles declared that he was king of the Franks and king of the Lombards. Desiderius and his family became prisoners in Frankia. Desiderius' son Adelchis had avoided capture, but he realized that there was no safe refuge in Italy, so he fled to Constantinople. Around this time, Charles finally captured his nephews, and nothing is written about them again. They may have been killed, but they were probably placed in monasteries. Remote monasteries with trustworthy abbots. Speaking of monasteries, when Charles conquered the Lombard kingdom, he reconciled with his cousin Adelard, who was persuaded to return to the monastery at Corbie, where he would become abbot. Since the Lombard kingdom was actually a loose collection of duchies that had reluctantly acknowledged the authority of a king, there was no resistance after Pavia was captured. After placing a strong garrison in Pavia, Charles returned home. While the ruling family were thrown into monasteries, most of the officials and nobles of Lombardy remained in place, so the transition in rulers seemed to have been smooth. That summer, the papacy invaded Spoleto to carry out a quick regime change, installing a more cooperative candidate on the throne. However, Benevento was more powerful, so it not only retained its independence, but Duke Arichis, Desiderius's son-in-law, gave himself a promotion to prince. While Arichis threatened to be a problem, Benevento was far away. However, Duke Hrodgaud of Friuli gained sufficient support from other dukes to declare himself king of the Lombards in 775, so Charles marched into Italy again in early 776. Hrodgaud died during the fighting, and Charles switched from a policy of light governance to firm control. Frankish counts were appointed to govern the cities in the Lombard kingdom, replacing Lombard bishops and counts with Franks and Alemannians. Time was tight since Charles had to return to Frankia in the summer to deal with the Saxon revolt, so he settled for vague terms of submission from Spoleto and Benevento. The fall of Desiderius did not benefit the papacy as much as expected. Pope Hadrian had hoped that Charles would use his new authority to force the Lombards to hand over estates in Lombard territory, and more importantly, their revenue, to the papacy. However, that handover never happened, despite numerous letters from Hadrian to Charles urging him to benefit both of their souls by handing over estates with their revenues to the papacy. Moreover, the Archbishop of Ravenna remained the dominant authority in the city with its own militia. Unsatisfied, Hadrian asked whether Rome had even benefited from the defeat of Desiderius, since it had not received any of the lands that it claimed. In particular, the residents of Venice, Istria, and Ravenna refused to accept that they belonged to the Papal Republic. In fact, this perspective makes it clear that the issue was not a simple matter of scratching out one name on the ownership papers and writing in the Pope. Instead, Hadrian seemed to want Charles to march south and tell the residents of Venice, Istria, and Ravenna that it did not matter what they wanted, their cities, and, more important, their tax revenue, belonged to the papacy. Unfortunately for Hadrian, Charles simply was not very interested in Italy. No disrespect to Italy, but it was a sideshow to Charles, probably because the Alps separated Francia from Italy. The Saxons were next door, so Charles was determined to keep the Saxons peaceful, or more accurately, force them to accept his rule. While Hadrian undoubtedly grumbled, he was well aware that the elimination of the Lombard kingdom as an independent entity was a huge advantage for the papacy. As a result, Hadrian did not try to forge an alliance with the other powers in Italy, since the Papal Republic was secure and had even expanded its territory, if nowhere near as much as he wanted. Up until now, Charles's campaigns had been largely successful, since he had crushed the Lombards and was steadily expanding into Saxon territory. By 777, Charles had made enough progress in his conquest of Saxony that he held the annual assembly of Frankish nobles in Saxon territory to receive the formal submission of the Saxons. After several years of warfare, the campaign to turn Saxons into Christian members of Greater Frankia appeared to be going smoothly. Suddenly, 3 Muslim rulers arrived at the assembly. Their arrival was not unexpected, since they had been promised safe conduct, but their appearance was undoubtedly a shock. The 3 men were the rulers of Barcelona, Zaragoza, and Huesca, cities in the northeastern part of al-Andalus, and they had journeyed far, far north to Saxony to ask Charles to march into the Iberian Peninsula to help them maintain their autonomy against Emir Abd al-Rahman. Unknown to the 3 rulers, they had good timing. If Charles had been worried about the Saxon campaign and his recent conquest of the Lombard kingdom, he would have listened politely and made some vague expression of sympathy without any concrete offer of support. However, he clearly felt secure, and it was an excellent opportunity. While it may seem risky to invade a kingdom on the other side of the Pyrenees, Charles had done the exact same thing 4 years earlier when he had crossed the Alps to invade the Lombards. Okay, how would this expensive and possibly dangerous intervention benefit Charles and his nobles? There is no record that the three rulers offered a throne to Charles. Instead, they appear to have expected that the king of the Franks and the Lombards would be satisfied with a bit of territory in the northeast near the Pyrenees, and undoubtedly a fair amount of looting along the way. In return, Charles would help them force the emir to remain in Cordoba, abandoning his plan to extend his authority northeast. Were the three rulers naive? Probably. It seems unlikely that Charles would march a large army over the Pyrenees for a bit of loot, the addition of a small slice of land to Frankia, and the opportunity for some sightseeing. To be fair to the three Muslim rulers, they may have preferred a distant overlord on the other side of a mountain range to a nearby overlord. Also, it is true that Charles's rule over his new Lombard kingdom was relatively light. A better question is, why did local Arab rulers want help from the expansionist Christian king of Frankia? The answer is simple. Emir Abd al-Rahman. As I explained a couple of episodes earlier, Abd al-Rahman had ended a civil war and then established a new emirate in al-Andalus in 756, 20 years earlier. Although he claimed to be emir of the entire Iberian Peninsula, the majority of existing rulers of independent regions had probably expected that Abd al-Rahman would carve out a sizable territory, but remain one of a number of local rulers. To be clear, previous governors had been unable to exercise real authority over local leaders, but Abd al-Rahman was determined to rule directly. In fact, Abd al-Rahman had proved to be a skilled political operator who steadily gathered allies. As it became clear that he was entrenched in al-Andalus, other Umayyad survivors made their way to the peninsula, increasing his number of supporters. The stronger regions like Toledo and Zaragoza successfully resisted, but he still steadily extended his authority in the southern part of the peninsula. Moreover, Abd al-Rahman acted like the ruler of all of al-Andalus. The various local strongmen just wanted to control their own region, and lacked the resources or interest for major construction projects. Instead, the new emir created a bureaucracy to process the tax revenue and manage the construction of infrastructure in new mosques. In particular, Cordoba was transformed into a royal capital. Despite later attempts to portray Charles's campaign in the Iberian Peninsula as a crusade against Muslims, he was simply taking sides in a Muslim civil war for his own benefit. The Frankish army had an impressive logistics system by this time, so each man arrived with 3 months' worth of food, which was handed over to the supply wagons, and more supplies were placed ahead on the route. Following the same basic plan as the invasion of Italy, Duke Bernard led one army through the eastern Pyrenees, while Charles led a second army through the west, and both armies would link up at Zaragoza, where they would be joined by their Arab and Berber allies. The march through the Pyrenees went smoothly, since the mountain passes were controlled by the Basques, who were Christian and, more important, routinely fought the Muslims of al-Andalus. The problems began when Charles arrived at Zaragoza, where he was surprised to learn that he was not allowed inside. Worse, Duke Bernard's army had marched to Barcelona and received a similar welcome, so it joined Charles at Zaragoza. At this point, Charles must have been confused. Well, confused and very angry, since envoys from Barcelona and Zaragoza had invited him into the Iberian Peninsula in the first place. Now both cities had kept their gates shut against him. Obviously, there is a story behind this dramatic change in policy. Part of the story is simple. The leader of Zaragoza, who had made the initial invitation, had been murdered by a rival. Possessing a less trusting nature, his successor believed that the Franks would probably make themselves comfortable in his city, so he refused to let them in. The leader of Barcelona may have been surprised by the size of the Frankish army, and realized that the Franks probably intended to stay, rather than simply help, and then return home with presents after a bit of sightseeing. Understandably annoyed, Charles laid siege to the city. However, he had not brought siege equipment, so he was stuck outside the city gates for 4 weeks, undoubtedly becoming angrier and angrier until news arrived that the Saxons had taken advantage of his absence to drive out the occupiers of their lands. Moreover, al-Andalus was not the Lombard kingdom. When faced with the relentless Frankish siege, King Desiderius was unable to force the autonomous Lombard dukes to risk their lives to save him. However, Abd al-Rahman had unified the southern part of the peninsula and was marching towards Zaragoza with a powerful army. Accepting that the intervention in al-Andalus would not succeed, Charles marched back over the mountains in a hurry to get back to Saxony in order to make the pagans understand the benefits of submission to Jesus of Nazareth and him, mainly him. Unfortunately, the Basques of Pamplona were less welcoming this time, and Charles needed an outlet for his frustration, so he sacked the city. Given the size of his army, Charles probably did not worry about the consequences of his actions. Well, he should have worried, since the large army was strung out along mountain passes. The Basques understandably wanted revenge, and they got it when they slaughtered the rear guard of the Frankish army on August 15, 778. Among the dead were Anselm, Count of the Palace, and Roland, Lord of the Breton Marches, who must have wondered why he was fighting so far from his home as the Basques swarmed towards him. The experience had been a disaster. A single Muslim city had successfully defied the huge Frankish kingdom, while Charles had sacked the only Christian city in the region. Clearly, the entire event remained a sensitive topic since his biographers glossed over the campaign decades later. The defeat was more than embarrassing. It made Charles look weak, or at least incompetent. If he had experienced another defeat soon after, his prestige would have been dangerously damaged, and lords would have been less willing to join his campaigns. However, Charles rebounded once he was back on familiar terrain, and he had good fortune since there was no serious external threat. Wait, everyone knows that Roland was killed by treacherous Muslims, not fellow Christians. There is even a famous poem about the event, the Song of Roland. Well, that is the legend, so a little explanation is required to show how such a dramatic change occurred. I will discuss Charles's promotion from king to emperor in a couple of episodes, but as emperor, he became the champion of Christendom. Various poets labored to spread that image because they would be rewarded by his heirs. Finally, 3 centuries later, a poet merged together several other poems to write the Song of Roland, taking major artistic license or jumbling the facts to please his audience, depending on your interpretation. Anyway, he produced a key myth of the Christian crusade against the Muslims, transforming Roland, a lord tasked with disciplining the Bretons who was killed by Basques, into Roland, a valiant knight who sacrificed himself for Frankish honor against a devious Saracen enemy. To sum up, following a request from the Pope, Charles invaded the Lombard kingdom. Unable to defeat the Frankish army, King Desiderius retreated to Pavia to outwait the Franks. However, Charles was determined and maintained a siege through the winter. When Desiderius finally surrendered, he was exiled to a remote monastery, and Charles announced that he was now king of the Franks and king of the Lombards. Returning to his conquest of the Saxons, Charles took a break to intervene in a Muslim civil war in al-Andalus. However, the intervention was a disaster. Charles had been invited by several rulers in the northeast of the peninsula, but they refused to let his army enter their cities when they realized that Charles intended to make himself at home in the region. Unable to force his way into the cities, Charles returned home, but unleashed his frustration on the Christian Basques, sacking their city Pamplona. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can buy me a coffee.